Welcome to Inside the WSOP. This is episode number 3. The first one was done by Matt Berkey. The second one was done by Jordan Young. So if you haven't checked those out, please do so. They were a lot of fun. Now, in this hand will come from a $1,500 six-max tournament. It's one of the few six-max tournaments in the series, so it'll be a pretty interesting hand. Of course, European Kid opens 1,500 at 600 big blind off a stack of 32K. The cutoff calls, and now the action's on us on the button with pocket fours. And sometimes people do 3-bet here, but I'm going to choose to just call. We start the hand with 35K. The big blind will also come along, and we're going 4-way to the flop. The flop will come 6, 5, 4 with 2 hearts and a spade. The 6 and the 5 are hearts, and there's 1 spade, which is the 4. It checks to us. And now we have a decision between sizing. So we're obviously going to be betting. I'm going to choose a size of 3,000. Now, this is like roughly a little bit under half pot, something like 40-ish% pot. And I think this is a pretty fair bet. We're pretty much going to be trying to take away here a decent amount of the time. 4-way is a little harder than if it was heads up or 3-way. But this board hits our range, and we're going to want to be betting. So we're going to be betting here rather often. We don't need to bet that large. And we obviously have a pretty lock hand, so we do want to entice players to come along. So we bet 3,000, and the action is going to fold around to the original raiser. The original raiser is now going to check raise to 7,500, and everyone else is going to fold, and it's on us. Now we have a pretty interesting decision here, and I think this is the most interesting portion of the hand. So when we classify his range, I think his range is probably going to be something like 7Xs, some flush draws that are combo draws potentially, and a very small percentage of the time he'll have some overpairs. However, it seems a little unlikely he would take this size with overpairs, so I am heavily weighting his range to like some draw heavy hands, potentially with a sprinkle of like overpairs, maybe hands like 7s, maybe hands like 8s. Even though I think he's more incentivized to be check calling those kind of hands. So now we have a decision whether we want to like put in a 3-bet on the flop or we want to just call. And I think this is where most players potentially get it wrong. Now there is an incentive for us to deny and etc. However, I think we play rather perfectly moving forward, and we allow ourselves to protect our range just by calling. Now, when we call, we're going to have some sets. We're going to have locks. Like straights, we're going to have combo draws ourselves, etc. So I think a call incentivizes our entire range. It also gives us some very disguised nut hands moving forward. The turn will come a 6, giving us bottom boat. Obviously a very favorable card. Now all of his draws are pretty much drawing dead. Our opponent's going to bet 8,000, and now again we have a decision whether we want to raise or call. At this point, I think our opponent is effectively drawing dead the majority of the time. So I think that just calling is going to like favor our range as a whole. I think at this point we're probably going to be shedding a lot of our draws, etc. Because it's just like too expensive. So this is actually the leverage point in the hand, and I think this is potentially where our opponent fails. He does bet and we call, and the river is going to come the king of clubs. So at this point, I think that my range is probably shedding the majority of our draws, and like we're going to land on the river like relatively nutted. Our opponent's going to move in, and obviously we call, and it shows 9-7 of spades. So he did have an open in the straight draw, picked up a flush draw on the turn. I don't know if I mentioned that the turn was actually the 6 of spades, and that is, I think, a very ambitious line by him. I understand the merits. However, I think once we call through the turn, I think he has to shift to just like realizing his equity. It's unlikely that we're going to have a hand that calls a check raise, calls the turn bet, and then now folds river. I think we're going to land on the river relatively nutted. And I understand the fact that he thinks that we have a decent amount of hearts and he unblocks those hearts. But I think a lot of those hands are just going to be like shedding turn. So I thought it was a pretty interesting hand. I thought there was 2 decision points in the hand that were relatively interesting. I think the flop decision is relatively interesting in terms of, do we want to put in a 3-bet or do we want to just call? Turn, I think, is relatively standard for us. I think we just have to call, allow him to keep betting. I think on his end, potentially, once we call turn, like, we probably should be shutting it down. Whether he wants to check raise or not on flop, I think is relatively interesting too. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think that it depends on how he's constructing his range. I think that it's definitely not terrible to have some check raises on that board. However, he's really incentivized to be checking that board, and he did. So I thought that was relatively okay. So yeah, I think this was a pretty cool hand. It propelled me pretty much into the money in the 1506 max. So that was a pretty cool hand, very favorable for us, of course. Always interesting and nice when you flop a set. So this was Inside WSOP, episode number 3. Up next, I believe, is Matt Hunt, who is going to be talking very likely about his deep run in the Venetian 1.1K. So with that said, cut.